We talked about defining classes, and that classes use constructors to create instances of that class, and the destructor destroys that instance of the class. Now we can create a class without defining any of these methods. C++ gives you a default constructor and a destructor. So let's look at our temperature class. We created a temperature class, and in that class we stored our double Celsius value, and we wrote constructors for the default and also to take some parameters, and we wrote a destructor. And in each of those, if we put a little statement in there to say that it's been called, we can see when we run our program that the ones that we wrote were called. So we have our default constructor when we declare a variable of type temperature and don't pass in any parameters, then that uses the default constructor. So the first one is created with the default constructor, and we use 0 to assign that value. The next one, we used one parameter. Well, we didn't define a constructor with one parameter, but we did define a constructor with two parameters, with the second one having a default. So since we only passed in one parameter, it will use the default for the second parameter, and that will use our constructor with two parameters. And so we can see here that our constructor with two parameters was called for our second item. Next we have another temperature, and this time we passed in the two parameters, and so we will expect that same constructor to be called. And here it is. And since we passed in a 0, but we said that that 0 meant 0 degrees Fahrenheit, it converted that to Celsius in order to store that in the negative 17.7. When we write it out, each of the temperatures, we're writing out the Fahrenheit temperature. So temp A is 32 degrees because that's the same as 0 Celsius. Temp B is also 0, so it's 32 degrees. And then we did create the C with 0 Fahrenheit, so we do expect this 0 Fahrenheit. When the program ends, these variables go out of scope and the destructor is called, and so we can see that it went into the destructor that we wrote. And what the slide is saying that we don't have to write a default constructor. We don't have to write a destructor because those are provided for us automatically. So if we go in here and we comment out our destructor and we comment out our default constructor, and C++ is going to provide it for us. And so we have to also not declare it in our header if we want C++ to create it for us. So now I only have our two parameter constructor. Now it's the same code. So now let's look at what's happening here. Well, it doesn't like the constructor here. I said C++ would provide one for you, but only if you don't have another one defined. So we can't use our constructor with two parameters either. So let's take that one out and out of the header too. And now if we go back to our main program, now it's happy with creating our default object, but it doesn't know how to create with two parameters because we don't have that defined anymore. So let's create them all with default and see what happens. So what we have are our three temperatures. We weren't able to set any value, and so it just picked up the values that were there in memory, whatever garbage was there, wrote out our three different temperatures. Notice that it doesn't say in the default constructor because it's not calling anything that we wrote. It's what C++ is providing for us. Also notice that it's not writing out that it's in the destructor because the destructor wasn't defined. So if we go back and put those back in, we go back and define our destructor. You can see that we can selectively replace any of those C++ provided ones with our own just by declaring and defining them.